Check Podcasts.
Hi, I'm Bruce Williams, CEO of the Greater Victoria Chamber of Commerce. Welcome to Chamber Chats, coming to you as always from here at the podcasting studios at the Czech Media Group, one of our chamber champions. I, of course, live and work in the ancestral lands of the Lekwungen-speaking nations known to us as Songhees and Esquimalt, or Kosapsum, who have been stewards of this land for millennia. Chamber Chats is made possible by the support of Island Savings, a division of First West Credit Union, who are redefining what banking can do for people, for communities, and for our planet. Something that's happening at an alarming rate across Canada, indeed around the world, is something that we all hear about every single day, and that is homelessness. News reports happen here on Check and all kinds of other media outlets to talk about that, and a lot of us have different perspectives on that. We hear different stories. We have different points of view on it all, but the fact is, it's pretty bad, and it's been that way for a while. And there's things happening at all different levels. There are municipal efforts, there are regional efforts, provincial efforts, and on the national scale. We want to talk about it on a national scale because it is a national issue. An organization called the Canadian Alliance to End Homelessness. Tim Richter is the president and CEO. He's joining us now from Calgary. Tim, how are you?
I'm doing well, thank you. Thanks for having us.
Thank you for being here. And Elisabeth Noble is based here in Greater Victoria. She is the philanthropy lead in Canada for the Canadian Alliance to End Homelessness. Elisabeth, how are you?
I'm doing well. Thanks for having us, Bruce.
So we always do sort of a pre-interview before we do these things. And one of the things that we wanted to talk about was something you suggested, Elisabeth, and I'll get an answer from both of you on this. How did this get so bad? Like, how did we end up, Tim, how did we end up in the circumstance we have right now?
Well, I think you boil it down to something really simple. That homelessness is a housing problem, right? And the situation we see today hasn't always been with us, which is really interesting because a lot of people are assuming that the homelessness crisis we see today has always been here. But I'm old enough to remember a time when there wasn't mass homelessness, and it really began in 1980 when the federal government stopped investing in purpose-built rental construction, and then in the mid-90s eliminated our social and affordable housing programs. And since then, you see this rise of mass homelessness that we are seeing today actually been accelerated since the pandemic and by the cost of living crisis. And the homelessness, the scale of the loss of housing caused by our housing crisis is actually bigger than the loss of housing from Canada's largest natural disasters, right? Let's think about it this way. In 2013, in the flood in Calgary, 75,000 households were forced out of their homes. In a fire in Fort McMurray, there were, I think, 86,000 households. Last summer, Yellowknife, 25,000 households. We think that homelessness today affects between 265,000 and 300,000 people every year. Right? It's stunning when you think about that scale.
Yeah, the fact that you're a national organization, there's a National Housing Accord, Elisabeth, that was a part of the most recent federal budget. Tell me about that.
Well, I think Tim was probably better poised to speak about how that all came to be, but it was a collaboration between the Canadian Alliance to End Homelessness, the Smart Prosperity Institute in Ottawa, and RealPAC. Tim, do you want to say a bit more about how you pulled that together?
Yeah, well, I think it just comes down to realizing that homelessness is a housing crisis, and until we tackle the rental housing crisis, you see, you're certainly feeling that in the Greater Victoria area. And homelessness rises when rents go up and vacancy goes down, right? And you're seeing that in Victoria, in the Greater Victoria area. We're seeing it all across the country. And if we have a prayer of solving homelessness, we need to build a functioning, healthy, balanced rental housing system, both with market rental and, importantly, with deeply affordable rental. So, we reached out to our partners in the nonprofit housing world, Canadian Housing Renewal Association, housing policy experts, and RealPAC, investors, builders, developers, got together and said, well, what would it take to solve the housing crisis? And that became the National Housing Accord, and we released that last summer, and seems to have been a bit of a framework for the federal government's latest housing policy and budget.
Okay. Elisabeth, we're no different than a lot of places in the situation that we have. It's very visible. It's on the streets. We see it every day. Tell me how a national strategy works. I mean, we see what municipalities do, what the province has done, the CRD with housing, but put a national optic on this for me, if you would.
Yeah. Well, like Tim said, that this is a national crisis. And the challenge is that the impacts are felt on a local scale. And so it's often the, small nonprofit organizations, church food banks, really little bitty grassroots organizations that step up to the plate when neighbors start to be forced out of their homes and respond to an emergency which has arisen. But the reality is that there's a national set of policies that is causing this to occur in the first place. And there's a bit of a disconnect a lot of the time because the crisis is so urgent for someone who's forced out of their homes. You have to deal with it right now. But the scale of the need is so huge that no community has the ability to solve it alone. We simply can't afford in Greater Victoria to just have the government build houses for everyone. We really need investment at the federal scale. And we need the policies that will actually encourage private investment, because no group of philanthropists and no government alone is actually going to be able to tackle the scale of housing need that we have. And so a national strategy looks like good policies that encourage investment, that attract philanthropic dollars, and that also encourage the lower levels of government to come to the table. And so, what a national strategy would look like, and Tim can again speak to this better than I can, is the same way we would respond to any national disaster. The feds lead with money, and then the local community leads in terms of how it gets actually executed. I'm not a disaster management response expert, but I think, Tim, if you have more to add around how that would actually function, that would be great.
Well, it is, as Elizabeth said, it's almost exactly the same as a disaster response. If you can imagine, God forbid, a natural disaster hits Greater Victoria area, there would be an emergency management system that would be brought together. You keep people safe from the emergency. You'd focus on, you'd have a command center, you'd have a plan, you'd have all the right people around the table developing this coordinated local response that's focused on responding to the emergency, getting people into housing, back into their homes as rapidly as possible. And then the senior levels of government come in to support. The province will come in areas where they have jurisdiction, and the federal government would do the same. Frankly, the response to homelessness on a national basis has to be organized exactly the same way.
We had a breakfast meeting with Premier David Eby a few weeks ago that the Chamber hosted, and one of the things that we asked him was that since the municipalities, for example, are involved with dealing with much of the issues surrounding these folks, a lot of that is healthcare, and a lot of that is also involving mental health care, which is supposed to be the purview of the province. So we said, will you be giving the municipalities money to deal with this? He said, no, they're not going to do that. So that part's been made pretty clear by the province, too. What we're going to do next is we're going to talk about a quiz. You can take a quiz, and we'll talk about that when we come back. Chamber Chats today is all about the national situation and the national perspective on the issue of homelessness. We're speaking with Tim Richter, who is the president and CEO of the Canadian Alliance to End Homelessness, and Elisabeth Noble, who is the philanthropy lead in Canada for the Canadian Alliance to End Homelessness. Elisabeth is based here in Greater Victoria, actually. Elisabeth, tell me about the quiz.
Yeah, so the quiz is available online at canadacandoit.ca, and it's designed to help people test their own knowledge about what causes homelessness, because there are times where our assumptions are actually getting in the way of the solutions. And so I encourage anyone who thinks that they know about homelessness or who cares about homelessness to go to canadacandoit.com or .ca, excuse me, and fill out the quiz and test your own knowledge to determine whether or not you actually know what it's going to take to end homelessness in Canada. And from there, you can also add your name to the movement to end homelessness nationally.
The day that we're recording this is May the 8th. And there was a report that came out yesterday or today, and I'm sorry, I can't pin it down exactly. The Our Place Society did a survey of the people living on the street on Pandora Avenue, and none of them want to be there. There is a perception from some people that these people are living a life that they should. No, they don't want to be there. That's not the case at all. So I want to, because you're a national organization, Tim, I'll come to you with this one. How does the strategy differ from region to region in Canada? I mean, part of that is weather, right? Because our weather is a little more favorable in most places. Tell me how much of a factor that is.
Well, funny enough, there's a really good book out of the United States, and it's called Homelessness as a Housing Problem. And one of the things they did was looked at different rates of homelessness across the United States. And they tried to explain why different cities had different amounts, different rates of homelessness. They looked at, is it the weather? Is it poverty? Is it addiction? Is it mental illness rates? Is it the government? Is it like Republican jurisdictions or Democrat jurisdictions? You know what they found? It's not the weather. It's not rates of addiction, right? California has got high rates of homelessness, but so do certain jurisdictions in Eastern United States with terrible Canadian weather, right?
Mm-hmm.
You have, the rates of poverty. You look at Detroit, some of the highest rates of poverty in the United States, some of the lowest rates of homelessness. You look at West Virginia, some of the highest rates of addiction and mental illness, some of the lowest rates of homelessness. You even look at, Democrat and Republican jurisdictions, again, rates of homelessness are independent of who is in charge. Where the difference is and why there's higher rates of homelessness comes down to your housing system. And if you have very high rents and very low vacancy, you have higher rates of homelessness, right? And I want to touch on an earlier point you made. And one of the things that's so challenging about ending homelessness isn't homelessness, right? It's the politics. You mentioned Premier Eby coming to speak to the Victoria Chamber. And one of the things that's bedeviling of this whole system, and I often joke that homelessness is the political equivalent of a junior high school dance, which each level of government standing around the edges of the dance floor, staring at their feet, waiting for somebody else to go first, right? One of the keys to ending homelessness is leadership. And that's why like the chamber and other groups can be so powerful and so important. If they can get the dance started, bring people together and say, look, for the crying out loud, let's fix this. This is a solvable problem. It hasn't always existed before. We know what it takes, right? We've done it before. Right. We were talking to a community in Ontario just the other day, St. Thomas Elgin.
Mm-hmm.
They have cut chronic homelessness by 30%. Right. Fort McMurray, Alberta, eliminated an encampment that had been in place for a very long time, moved people into housing. They were the second city in the country to end homelessness for veterans, and they'd cut chronic homelessness by more than half. Right. Homelessness is solvable, but it requires leadership.
Yeah, just for perspective, St. Thomas Elgin, for those who don't know, is just south of London, Ontario,
Yeah.
which I know because I lived in London for almost 20 years. Something else you brought up too, and Elisabeth, you and I have talked about this, the correlation or the relationship between addiction, mental illness, and homelessness. Too many people put too much emphasis on that. But at the same time, the survey that our place did tie the two together because many of the people living in that homeless colony identify as having an addiction problem. So how does that work into these solutions?
Yeah. This one always troubles me, Bruce, because I am a recovering addict and alcoholic. And I have lived experience of the issue, and I wouldn't wish what I went through on anyone else. And the reason that I'm not homeless today is that I had a support system. I had a very loving family that never gave up on me and that were able to take me in when I was in my most vulnerable moment. And when I went to treatment, I met young Indigenous women who were, basically raised on the downtown East Side, multi-level of intergenerational trauma, and they didn't have access to the same resources that I had to be able to exit. And in fact, living in Victoria, I had been here for a number of years and never actually befriended an Indigenous person before because my life was so isolated prior to entering that world of addiction. And it's very difficult for people to conceive of how quickly something like that can occur and just how completely separate that is from the housing issue. It's intersectional, right? So someone who is vulnerable and experiencing addiction and doesn't have the family resources that I have, if they go through what I went through, where my husband threatened to commit suicide, I left a job under dubious circumstances and I had a surgery go wrong and I had nothing to catch me in that moment. And fortunately, my friends and family were able to come in later. But if you don't have that, that could just be the end. Just those three things that came together in an unfortunate series of events for me, and that could be it. And so when we have very low vacancy, very high rents, the people without that additional support system, of course, they're the first ones to end up in a homeless encampment. But we're seeing rising trends of seniors and students and people who have absolutely no connection to mental health or addiction that are becoming homelessness now just because of the expense. And so, especially for those people who are already so vulnerable, we really need to step up as a community and provide that support system for people that didn't have it like me.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing your story. That's very moving. We
Mhm.
appreciate that.
Thanks,
Next
Bruce.
up, we're gonna talk about the political thing. Rather, go back to that and talk about something. Get a load of this: action over perfection. We'll talk about that next. Chamber chat today. We're talking about the Canadian Alliance to End Homelessness because it is a national issue. It's local, but it's also a national thing. Tim Richter is with me. He's the president and CEO of the Canadian Alliance to End Homelessness, and Elisabeth Noble is the philanthropy lead for Canada, based here in Victoria, for this organization. Tim, action over perfection. Go.
Well, you know what? There is no, I can't write you a 147-step plan to solve homelessness, right? Because every place, every community, every situation is a little bit different. But what we need to have is a bit of a process and a commitment to continuous improvement. And you know what? It's messy, and you're not going to get it right. But the key to solving the problem is in the private sector and in healthcare world, they call it data-driven continuous improvement. Really, it's understanding and seeing that there's a flow of people through a complex system. We need to understand who they all are by name, and then continue to test new ideas. Why did 27 people enter homelessness this month? Who were they? Why are they there? Why don't we try something to see if we can reduce that number? Why are so many people coming back? Let's figure out what to fix in that system. And it's a continuous process of trial and error. Too many places wait for the perfect, try to get the perfect plan, try to make sure they have a perfect alignment of resources, try to make sure that they've got the perfect situation all lined up in order to solve the problem. And you know what? That never works. You'll be waiting for perfection. So, we're far better off. Let's just keep trying stuff, get good data, continuously improve, because it's never, ever, ever going to be perfect, ever.
Yeah. To refer back to the premier thing, I'm not here to pick on the premier, but we said to him, there are people whose lives would be made better if they were put into involuntary care so that their addictions and their mental health issues could be taken care of. And he said, well, we don't have capacity to do that. My follow-up question, had there been time, would have been, well, do you want to keep spending money on what you're spending it on now, or do you want to spend money on a more solid solution? So that's where it comes down to a political decision too. Okay, so that's action over perfection. Elisabeth, what's fail forward? What's that mean?
I think it's the same thing that Tim was just talking about. Like, there's a real tendency to want to do things with all of the intersectionalities, recognize that, people are unique and they're all going to have different needs and try and do the perfect thing. And if we wait to get it perfect, we won't get it done. But there are evidence-based policies that we can employ, and we can do our best to ensure that we're not making mistakes that have already been made. We don't need to recreate the wheel. There's been lots of bad policies that have been tried, and yeah, failing forward, I think, is really meant for us as as an
Yeah.
organization. But as a society, I think that there's uh, the way that we're failing is by not doing enough. Homelessness is extraordinarily expensive for the economy. We had that meeting in person at the AGM where businesses were complaining about being able to go downtown. Customers are afraid because of the stigma around visible homelessness downtown. We're spending a lot of money as an entire community. Wouldn't it be better if we spent the money on things that are evidence-based and not, I would push back again on the involuntary treatment. I wouldn't have been able to accept
Yeah.
help until I was ready. And treatment should be a suite, just like a tiny part of a suite of services. And I think a lot of the time people hear like housing first, and they think that housing first has failed, when a lot of the time that's because we've provided housing only. Housing First is a rigorous, structured, recovery-oriented mental health intervention, which is very different than what a lot of assumptions are when you just give someone a place to be and then all of their other problems go away. And of course, that's absurd. We need to provide everything that everyone needs. It needs to start with housing, but it needs to provide that additional safety net that I spoke about earlier, that the community can provide for someone who doesn't have the resources I did.
Yeah, you hear the term complex care quite often, each individual treated as an individual, right? Now,
Yeah.
because you're a national organization, Tim, you have a progress map. Tell me about the progress map, rather.
Yeah, so we're working with 50 communities or 50 plus communities around the country that are committed to ending chronic or veteran homelessness. And we're tracking our progress around the country and how where we're having success and where we're having some challenges. That outlines we've got real-time data in all of these communities, and they're able to track their progress. What we're seeing right now, to be frank, is a surge in new homelessness. And we took a sample from 11 of the communities that we're working with. And between I'd say March of 20 or February 2020, just before the pandemic, and last October, we've seen an average increase of well over 50% in some communities and 100 plus percent in some communities of chronic homelessness. And that is really shocking, and it is right down to the cost of housing.
Yeah. Just to wrap it up here, we could talk about this all day, so we'll have to pick another day and do this again. But Elisabeth, what can we do? People listening to this or watching this right now, what can we do to help advance the work that you're doing?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that there's two really important things. One is that people cannot sit around and complain. We all know that there is a problem. And when people are complaining and not doing something, it actually makes the political climate even more challenging to get anything done. This is the internet is terrible for polarizing people. So I encourage everyone is invited into the movement to end homelessness. And so you can easily find us online at CAEH.ca, which is the Canadian Alliance to End Homelessness. You can also go to the CanadaCanDoIt.ca website. And either of those places, you can add your name. You can also donate to the work that we do.
Don't think you can't make a difference in this, because we all can. The website again is CAEH, Canadian Alliance to End Homelessness.ca. Tim Richter is the president and CEO. Elisabeth Noble is the philanthropy lead for Canada. Thank you both for being here today.
Thanks, Bruce.
And that's it for this week. I'm Bruce Williams. We'll see you again for another Chamber Chat.